So, Prince William and Catherine just confirmed that Queen Camilla has been ordered out of Windsor Lodge. And the way this all went down is genuinely stranger than most people realize, because for weeks Camilla was acting like that place was hers forever. Not just staying there. Not just using it. But treating it like she had full ownership. She was allegedly approving expensive renovations, changing long-standing staff arrangements, restricting access, and presenting the residence to guests as though Charles had personally handed her permanent control. And nobody pushed back at first. That silence gave her room to keep going. But then Catherine apparently noticed something Camilla never expected anyone to question. Several personal items associated with Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had reportedly been removed from rooms where they had traditionally been kept. They weren't simply misplaced. They had allegedly been wrapped, labelled, and moved into storage under instructions connected to Camilla's office. William had not approved the move. Catherine had not been consulted. And other members of the family apparently weren't told until one frightened staff member finally broke ranks. That disclosure changed everything. What had looked like redecorating suddenly appeared much more serious. Portraits were moved. Guest rooms were reassigned. Family arrangements were changed. Staff members who questioned the decisions were allegedly told that the residence now answered to the Queen. Now, before we go any further, if you're enjoying this breakdown and you want more royal updates as they happen, hit that subscribe button and join us here. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel keep covering these stories. Okay. Catherine didn't explode when she found out. She did something much more effective. She asked for the records. Storage lists began arriving. Then renovation requests. Then access instructions. Then written objections from household administrators. And one warning allegedly stated that certain objects could not be moved without family approval. Camilla's office had received that warning. Yet the move reportedly went ahead anyway. That's when William became directly involved. He discovered that one sealed box reportedly contained an item connected to Diana, something he believed should never have been moved without his knowledge. For William, this was no longer about furniture. It wasn't about decoration. And it wasn't even primarily about Camilla's choice of staff. It had become a question of authority, family history, and whether someone could simply behave as though a shared royal residence had become private territory. William wanted one answer. Who gave the final order? According to the version of events being circulated, the paper trail didn't end with a junior employee. It allegedly led back toward Camilla's private office, despite earlier objections. And that's where the situation became much more complicated. Because royal resources were reportedly being used to support changes that had not received the level of approval expected for such a residence. Catherine still tried to keep everything private. She reportedly sent a message asking Camilla to restore the removed belongings, pause the renovations, and reconsider the access restrictions until the household could review the situation. But the response allegedly wasn't conciliatory. Camilla reportedly maintained that Windsor Lodge fell under her authority. Catherine, according to this account, should focus on her own household. That answer changed the temperature completely. Catherine had approached privately because she wanted to avoid embarrassing Charles. Instead, her attempt at diplomacy was apparently interpreted as weakness. And the restrictions continued. A family visit was reportedly cancelled. Staff arrangements changed again. A guest room was reassigned. New instructions allegedly appeared regarding who could enter and when. The message was becoming increasingly obvious. Camilla wasn't simply occupying the residence. She appeared to be establishing control over it. But permanence requires proof. So William asked for the original documents. Not an aide's explanation. Not a verbal assurance. The actual paperwork. He wanted to know the occupancy terms, the funding arrangements, the authority over staff, and whether Camilla had actually been granted permanent control. And according to the story, that's where the biggest surprise appeared. There was no clear document giving her unrestricted ownership. No straightforward permanent grant. Instead, the arrangement was reportedly conditional. And buried inside those conditions was language concerning proper use of the residence and the authority of the household to intervene if those conditions were breached. Suddenly, the entire situation looked different. Camilla's position might have been powerful, but it wasn't necessarily unlimited. William didn't confront her immediately. He waited. He wanted the records checked against the spending, the staffing changes, the storage orders, the access restrictions, the renovation requests, and the warnings. because if he challenged Camilla without evidence, the story could easily be dismissed as a family disagreement. William wanted something stronger. He wanted a documented pattern. Catherine helped build that pattern. Every cancelled arrangement was recorded. Every staff reassignment was dated. Every access restriction was preserved. Every objection was placed beside the response it received. And gradually, what had started as a private dispute became a complete file. Then another staff member reportedly came forward. This person had been around the lodge long enough to understand how things normally worked. And according to the account, they had kept copies of instructions that others were too afraid to preserve. One document allegedly instructed staff to remove several family belongings before an upcoming visit. The timing was significant. The objects weren't reportedly being moved because of an emergency. They were being moved before certain family members could see what had changed. And attached to the instruction was reportedly an earlier warning. The warning questioned whether the belongings could be transferred without consultation. The transfer allegedly happened anyway. That was the moment the dispute became impossible to explain as simple confusion. If the account is accurate, the problem wasn't that nobody knew there were limits. The problem was that the limits had apparently been raised and ignored. William then requested a full review. Officials were asked to examine occupancy, security, staffing, maintenance, spending, access, and the removal of belongings. Nothing would be accepted simply because someone claimed that Charles had approved it. Every claim needed evidence. And that created another problem. Camilla's representatives allegedly argued that Charles had given verbal permission. But where was the written confirmation? Where was the amendment? Where was the formal authorization? Where was the document granting permanent control? According to the story, officials couldn't find one. And that distinction mattered. A king allowing his wife to use a residence isn't necessarily the same thing as permanently transferring authority over it. Permission to renovate isn't necessarily permission to use royal resources however one wishes. And access to a residence isn't necessarily ownership of everything inside it. The more the documents were examined, the more uncomfortable the situation reportedly became. Eventually, William and Catherine were said to have approved the next step. A formal notice was prepared. It allegedly ordered unauthorized work to stop, restored household administration, and required Camilla's private staff to leave. And then came the detail that made the entire story explosive. The keys had to be surrendered. No dramatic announcement was prepared. No cameras were invited. The palace, according to the account, wanted the transition handled quietly. But inside Windsor Lodge, the atmosphere was reportedly completely different. Staff began packing. Personal files were removed. Garment cases were carried downstairs. Photographs were wrapped. Boxes were labelled. Officials arrived to supervise an inventory. Every item had to be identified. And that is where another confrontation allegedly occurred. Some objects claimed as Camilla's personal belongings were reportedly identified as part of the lodge collection. Her aides objected, but the officials asked for documentation. If an item was genuinely personal property, it could leave. If it belonged to the residence, it stayed. That simple rule began restoring a boundary that had apparently become blurred. Room by room, the residence was being returned to household control. William and Catherine weren't there, and that was reportedly deliberate. Their absence prevented the handover from becoming a personal confrontation. There would be no shouting match, no dramatic scene for cameras, just paperwork, inventories, keys, and officials following written instructions. Eventually, Camilla reportedly entered the entrance hall. She was composed at first. She questioned the timetable. She questioned the authority of the officials. She reportedly argued that discussions with Charles were still continuing. But the response was simple. Those discussions did not automatically suspend the notice. The deadline had arrived. Then the confrontation became more personal. Camilla allegedly accused Catherine of turning the dispute into a campaign against her. She reportedly suggested that William was using Diana's memory to strengthen his position. But the officials didn't debate family history. They returned to the documents. The issue was allegedly about access, staffing, spending, and the treatment of family property. Nothing more. Nothing less. One final key reportedly became the center of the dispute. A private room had allegedly been kept closed. An aide refused to surrender the key. For several minutes, the handover stopped. but officials checked the residence schedule. The room was included. There was no private exception, no permanent personal suite, no special right to retain control. Eventually, the key was surrendered. And with that, the final barrier fell. By late afternoon, Camilla's personal vehicles were ready. Staff left in stages. Packages were checked. Boxes were inventoried. The residence slowly emptied. And then came the question the palace couldn't avoid. Would William and Catherine say anything publicly? Some advisors reportedly preferred silence. They believed the departure could be described as a routine change. But too many people supposedly knew what had happened. Too many records existed. And silence could allow completely different versions of events to spread. So William and Catherine allegedly chose their words carefully. The message was simple. Camilla had vacated Windsor Lodge. Her private staff no longer controlled the residence. The keys had been returned. The unauthorized work had stopped. And household administration had resumed control. But even if that is the version of events being presented, the bigger question remains. Why did it reach this point? Because if Camilla had simply been using the lodge temporarily, there would have been no reason for such a dramatic confrontation. If the renovations had been fully authorized, the paperwork should have settled the issue. If every item had been moved with permission, the storage records should have explained it. If family access had never been restricted, there would have been no reason to document those restrictions. And if permanent authority had genuinely been granted, there should have been something official proving it. Instead, the controversy reportedly grew because every unanswered question created another question. And every alleged warning that was ignored made the next step more serious. Catherine's role was especially important. She reportedly didn't begin with retaliation. She began with documentation. She didn't try to win a public argument. She tried to establish what had actually happened. That may have been the most effective move of all. Because once the paperwork existed, the dispute was no longer simply about personalities. It became about procedure. And procedure is much harder to dismiss. William, meanwhile, was reportedly forced to confront something even more uncomfortable. Family trust cannot replace documentation. A verbal understanding may work until someone challenges it. But once there is a dispute over royal property, staffing, money, or family belongings, everyone wants proof. That may be the real lesson behind this entire controversy. Status can open doors. A title can command attention. And proximity to the king can create enormous influence. But none of those things automatically mean unlimited authority. And if the reports surrounding Windsor Lodge are accurate, that is precisely where Camilla's position allegedly collided with a boundary she couldn't simply ignore. The final irony is that this entire confrontation might have been avoided. Had the belongings been restored after the first objection? Had access restrictions been reconsidered? Had the renovations been paused? Had the paperwork been reviewed? The dispute might have remained private. Instead, every alleged refusal created another record. Every decision created another witness. And every warning reportedly ignored made the eventual intervention harder to reverse. So, whether this story ultimately proves to be as dramatic as claimed or turns out to be a heavily embellished royal rumor, one thing makes it compelling. It isn't really about a residence. It's about what happens when royal power meets a written boundary. And if William and Catherine truly did step in over Windsor Lodge, the most important question isn't simply why Camilla left. It's who allowed the situation to continue for so long, and why nobody stopped it sooner. Because once the keys were finally handed back, the argument was no longer about who controlled one royal residence. It was about where authority ends. And inside the royal family, that may be the much bigger battle.